The phone call came in on a Sunday morning, the last day in a string of gray November days that seemed to set the tone for life lately. Jake Hayes was sitting alone in his apartment in Chicago, sipping his coffee and watching the city wake up below from the 25th floor. His mind wandered to the job he'd applied for at Kingsley Dynamics, one of the big players in mechanical engineering. This was supposed to be his next step. After nearly a decade at Central Tech Industries, Jake had decided it was time for a change. It was during this job hunt that he had begun noticing things in his life that had been amiss for a while, only now they were too glaring to ignore. Jake was 44, and he wasn't naive. He had a good head on his shoulders and an instinct for people. Yet he had trusted his wife, Melissa, from the moment they met back at Purdue University when they were both in their 20s. Melissa was captivating back then, brimming with ambition and a free-spirited charm that stood out in a sea of seriousness. Over the years, though, he had come to learn the hard way that ambition could hide 1,000 flaws. As the years passed, Jake and Melissa built a life together in Chicago, moving up in their respective careers. Melissa eventually opened her own interior design firm, and Jake took a senior engineer position. They bought a house in Lakeview, where Melissa wanted to live because of the scene. They settled into routines. They worked long hours, sometimes barely seeing each other for more than a meal or two each week. When Jake thought about it, their interactions were like transactions. They shared a few dinners, the occasional conversation about work, friends, and family, but nothing more. The spark that once drove into her was only a memory. And then the phone call came. "Jake, hey, this is Tony, from next door." Tony had lived in the same building for years. They shared the occasional elevator ride and hallway small talk, but Tony never called. The tension in his voice made Jake sit up. "What's going on, Tony?" Jake asked, feeling the slight chill that only comes with a call you don't expect. "I didn't want to be the one to say this, man, but you should know what's going on. I've seen Melissa coming home with someone else." The words didn't land as hard as Jake might have expected. They felt distant, unreal, as if Tony was talking about someone else's life. He knew things weren't right between him and Melissa, but he hadn't put any concrete thought into why they felt so broken. "Are you sure?" Jake managed after a pause, almost hoping Tony would laugh it off and say he was wrong. "I'm sorry, man. I know it's not my business, but it's been happening enough that it was starting to feel wrong just ignoring it. I'm here if you need anything." Jake muttered a quick thanks, and they ended the call. He sat back in his chair, looking out at the familiar cityscape, but everything seemed different now, sharper somehow, as though he were seeing the details of his life more clearly. He sat there, processing, until the sun rose higher, and the city came fully to life. In that moment, he knew he was done pretending things were fine. Later that day, Jake decided to get some fresh air. He grabbed his coat, locked up, and headed out onto the busy Chicago streets. The sounds of the bustling Sunday crowd filled the air, and it was comforting in a way, like being part of something bigger while trying to make sense of his own little world falling apart. As he walked down the crowded streets, he thought back to how everything had begun with him and Melissa. It was nearly 2 decades ago now. She had been charismatic, charming her way into people's hearts with ease. She was always surrounded by friends, mostly men back in college, but Jake didn't mind. He was drawn to her openness, the way she made everyone feel like they belonged. They married after graduation, moving straight to Chicago and jumping headfirst into the working world. Jake had his doubts from the start, rumors here and there, whispers he ignored. When he'd hear that she was out with an old friend, he shrugged it off. He was working late, so who was he to complain? But each small seed of doubt grew, buried in his mind, sprouting only in the quiet moments late at night. Now, after all these years, it seemed like everything was coming into focus. Jake spent the day wandering through the city, trying to put his thoughts in order. He didn't want to confront Melissa without knowing what he would say. He didn't want to be angry or lose control. Jake wanted answers, and he wanted to understand what had gone so wrong between them. When he finally returned to the apartment that evening, he found Melissa sitting in the living room, wrapped in a plush robe with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up as he came in, giving him a smile that seemed strangely distant. "Hey, you were out all day?" she said. raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" Jake nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just needed to clear my head. Work's been a bit much lately, you know?" She laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Isn't it always?" she replied. She was already tuning out, her attention drifting back to her phone, where she scrolled mindlessly, her wine glass balanced on the edge of the table. He wanted to say something, wanted to bring up the phone call from Tony, the cold distance that had settled between them, all the things he had been pushing to the back of his mind. But he stopped himself, unsure if now was the right time. Instead, he stood there in silence, watching her, wondering how long he'd been convincing himself that this was the life he wanted. Melissa barely noticed him standing there, her gaze already somewhere else. It was strange to realize how far apart they drifted. He wondered if she even knew how much she was hurting him. In the weeks that followed, Jake kept his routine. He went to work, spent hours at his desk, and stayed out late to avoid coming home. He had a few close friends at Central Tech, but he hadn't opened up to them about his suspicions. He wasn't even sure what he'd say. At 44, Jake had never thought he'd be one of those guys with a crumbling marriage and no one to turn to. But here he was. Eventually, Jake stopped in at a local bar on his way home from work. The bartender, a grizzled old guy named Lou, had seen him coming enough times that he started chatting him up. Lou was an excellent listener, always giving Jake a sympathetic nod as he poured his drink. One night, after a few too many drinks, Jake finally opened up. He told Lou about Melissa, about Tony's phone call, about how he felt like his life was spiraling out of control. Lou listened, nodding and offering a few words of advice here and there. "You know, sometimes you just gotta look out for yourself," Lou said, leaning against the bar. "People change, life changes, and sometimes that means letting go. It's not easy, but if you don't take care of yourself, who will?" Jake took Lou's words to heart. He couldn't keep living in this limbo, waiting for things to fix themselves. He needed a plan. In the following days, Jake took the first steps toward finding that way forward. He started putting away money in a private savings account. He reached out to a realtor friend, pretending he was interested in investment opportunities, but really looking for a potential escape plan. And for the first time in his life, he started thinking about life without Melissa. This was only the beginning, but Jake felt like a weight was lifting. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew he couldn't stay stuck in the life he was living. In the days following his late-night conversation with Lou, Jake felt a growing sense of clarity. He'd spent enough time pretending things were normal. He knew he had to confront Melissa. On Thursday evening, Jake came home early, the Chicago skyline casting a warm, fading glow across the living room. Melissa sat at the kitchen counter with her laptop open, surrounded by her design magazines and sketches. She didn't look up as he walked in, her face set in an expression he couldn't read. Taking a deep breath, Jake walked over to her, his heart racing. He thought about Tony's words, Lou's advice, and all the years he'd spent building a life with her. If she had been with someone else, he needed to hear it from her. "Melissa," he began, trying to steady his voice, "we need to talk." She looked up at him, her eyebrows raised. There was a flicker of annoyance in her eyes as though she couldn't be bothered. "About what?" she asked, her tone cold. "About us. About everything that's been going on lately," he replied, feeling his pulse quicken. Melissa gave a short, humorless laugh, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, Jake, don't start this again." Jake clenched his fists, the frustration and hurt that he'd been holding back finally breaking through. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Melissa. I know you've been seeing someone else. I got a call from Tony." For a moment, a flash of shock crossed her face, but she quickly masked it, her expression turning defiant. "Tony needs to mind his own business," she said sharply, crossing her arms. "And you need to stop acting like some kind of victim. Look around you, Jake. This marriage has been dead for years. Maybe you're just the last one to realize it." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had suspected things were bad, but hearing her confirm it was something else entirely. "So you're admitting it then?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Admitting what?" she replied, her voice thick with sarcasm. Admitting that I want more than what you can give me? Yes, Jake, I need more. You've been so busy with work and what? Tinkering with your latest gadgets you never even noticed. Jake felt the ground shift beneath him. I thought we were partners. I thought we were building something together. Melissa scoffed. Please, I've been building my career, my reputation, my own life. You think you were helping with any of that? You can't even handle a decent social gathering without fading into the background. Her words were laced with contempt. The silence that followed was thick, filled with everything they'd left unsaid over the years. So this is it then, he said, his voice hardening. You've been stepping out because you're not satisfied with your quiet life? She shrugged, a dismissive wave of her hand. If that's how you want to see it. Jake stood there, his mind racing. The weight of her betrayal was overwhelming, but what hurt even more was the realization that she didn't even care. She wasn't sorry. She was just indifferent. In her mind, this was all his fault. Well, maybe we should call it quits then, he said, hearing his own voice sound strangely calm. Maybe it's time we stop pretending that there's anything left here. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? You think you can just walk away after all the years I've put into this? She leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. You'd fall apart without me, Jake. You think you're strong, but you're nothing on your own. The words struck him deep, reigniting the years of self-doubt he had always struggled to overcome. But something had changed in him since that call from Tony. He wasn't the same man he'd been a few weeks ago. He felt a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in years. Maybe I would fall apart, but I'd rather do that than stay in a marriage where I'm disrespected, he replied, his voice steadier than he expected. He turned and left the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, afraid he'd lose his nerve if he saw her face again. That night, Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was racing, replaying the conversation over and over. He thought about all the years he'd spent putting Melissa first, sacrificing his own dreams and desires to make her happy. It was painful to realize that it had all been for nothing. But amidst the pain, a new feeling was beginning to take root. Freedom. The decision to walk away, to take control of his own life, filled him with a strange sense of exhilaration. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally waking up from a long, painful dream. The next morning, Jake called in sick and decided to take a walk along Lake Michigan. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a familiar sight that now felt different somehow. He watched the waves crash against the shore, feeling the cold wind whip against his face. It was a harsh reminder that life didn't stop for anyone, and neither could he. He pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to a divorce lawyer. He didn't know much about the process, but he figured it was time to get educated. He wasn't sure how Melissa would react, but he knew he had to take the first step. The second call was to a realtor. He knew selling their Lakeview house would be a long process, but he was ready to start. The thought of leaving the house that had once been their dream home no longer bothered him. It was just a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. After making the calls, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever came his way. That afternoon, he decided to stop by his favorite coffee shop, a small, cozy place called The Grind, tucked away in a quiet corner of Lincoln Park. He'd been coming here for years, finding solace in the familiar surroundings and the friendly baristas who greeted him by name. Today, though, he felt like a different person, almost as if he were shedding an old skin. As he sipped his coffee, he took out a notepad and began jotting down plans for the future. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but he had a few ideas. He'd always dreamed of starting his own engineering consultancy, and maybe now was the time to finally make that dream a reality. In a way, losing Melissa was freeing him from all the expectations and limitations he placed on himself. She had been his anchor, but she had also been his weight, holding him back from becoming the person he wanted to be. A week later, Jake met with the divorce lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Linda Crow. She listened to his story with a calm, professional demeanor, nodding thoughtfully as he recounted the events that had led him to her office. "I can help you with this, Mr. Hayes," she said, leaning forward, "but you need to be prepared for a fight. Divorce is rarely simple, especially in cases like this where there's infidelity involved. Melissa will likely try to get as much as she can from you, and she may not take kindly to you initiating the process." Jake nodded, already feeling the beginnings of a headache. He'd expected as much, but hearing it from a professional made it feel more real. "I'm ready for whatever it takes," he replied, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm done being the person she walks all over." Linda smiled slightly. "Good. We'll get started on the paperwork, and I'll walk you through everything step by step. It won't be easy, but you're making the right choice." Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into his work, using it as a way to distract himself from the chaos that was now his personal life. He began setting up a separate savings account, moving some of his funds out of their shared finances. He reached out to a few former colleagues, testing the waters for potential job opportunities in case he needed a fresh start. One day, as he was leaving his office, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from an old college friend, Mark, who worked as a manager at a tech firm in the suburbs. They hadn't spoken in years, but Mark had heard about Jake's situation through mutual friends and wanted to catch up. "Hey, man, I heard you're going through a rough time. Let's grab a beer sometime soon. I might have an opportunity for you if you're interested." The timing couldn't have been better. Jake knew he couldn't stay in the same place, working the same job, and seeing the same people who reminded him of everything he was trying to escape. Mark's offer felt like a lifeline, and he knew he had to take it. He replied to the message, setting up a time to meet later that week. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, he felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to the future. That evening, Jake returned to his apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. Melissa was out, as she often was, and the apartment was quiet. He looked around at the place they had once called home, filled with memories that no longer held any meaning for him. With a steady hand, he began packing a few boxes, carefully sorting through his belongings. He didn't know where he would end up, but he knew he wouldn't be staying here much longer. This chapter of his life was over, and he was ready to turn the page. Jake had always thought that leaving a marriage would feel like stepping into the unknown, but as the days passed, he felt oddly at peace. Each small step away from Melissa gave him a renewed sense of control over his life. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt he was walking in the right direction. On a chilly Wednesday evening, he met up with Mark, his college friend who had offered to help him out with a potential job lead. They met at a small pub in Oak Park, a quiet spot removed from the crowds and noise of downtown. Mark greeted him with a wide grin and a firm handshake, immediately ordering them a couple of beers. They reminisced for a while about old times, their shared memories of late-night study sessions and football games. Jake felt a comforting familiarity, a welcome distraction from the storm of emotions he was dealing with at home. "So, what's the latest, man? Heard you're going through a rough time," Mark finally said, giving Jake a sympathetic look. Jake sighed, swirling his beer. "Yeah, you could say that. Things with Melissa just fell apart. Guess I was the last to realize it." Mark nodded knowingly. "It happens. People change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But hey, now you've got a fresh start. And speaking of fresh starts," he said, his eyes lighting up, "we got a spot open at my firm. It's a bit of a step back, but it's got good potential, and I think you'd be a great fit. What do you say?" Jake took a sip, mulling it over. He'd spent over a decade working his way up in central tech industries. Starting over felt daunting, but he knew he couldn't stay there, surrounded by people who reminded him of the life he was leaving behind. "Thanks, Mark. Honestly, it sounds perfect. I think I'm ready for a change." Mark grinned, slapping him on the back. "Good to hear. I'll get you an interview next week. No promises, but I'll put in a good word." They spent the rest of the evening talking about the job and potential projects. For the first time in months, Jake felt a spark of excitement, a reminder of what life could be like if he let himself truly move on. The next morning, Jake woke up early feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He made himself coffee and went out onto the balcony, watching as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the city skyline. The world looked different somehow, sharper, brighter, filled with possibilities he hadn't seen before. Over the following weeks, Jake's life fell into a new routine. He'd been actively preparing to leave his old life behind, moving his money into a separate account and closing shared credit cards. He even sold off some old stock options he'd been holding on to, building a small nest egg that would help him stay afloat if things went south with Melissa. Jake had also moved forward with the realtor, putting their Lakeview house on the market. It was painful, walking through the empty rooms and realizing that the home they had built together was now just a shell. But with each box he packed, he felt a little closer to his new beginning. One night, as he was boxing up the last of his things, his phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer, Linda Crow. Linda. We're moving along with the filing, but I want you to be prepared. Melissa is likely going to contest the divorce, especially with the house on the line. This may get messy, Jake. He read the message and let out a slow breath. He knew Melissa wouldn't let go easily. She was used to getting her way, and he wasn't sure how far she'd go to keep control. Jake. Thanks, Linda. I appreciate the heads up. Just tell me what I need to do. Linda assured him she'd handle the paperwork and prepare for any tactics Melissa might throw at them. Jake felt a sense of reassurance knowing she was in his corner. A few days later, Jake had his interview at Mark's company, Forsyth Solutions. The office was modern and bright, filled with young professionals who buzzed with energy. Mark introduced him to the team, a mix of engineers, project managers, and a few fresh out-of-college interns. The interview went well. They discussed his experience in mechanical design, his years at Central Tech, and the skills he could bring to the company. It was a smaller role than he was used to, but the pay was solid, and the opportunity for growth was promising. Plus, the office was in Oak Park, close to the kind of quiet, suburban life he hadn't realized he missed. As Jake left the building, he felt a flicker of hope. For so long, he had been trapped in a cycle of resentment and disillusionment, bound to a life he no longer wanted. But now a new future was starting to take shape, one where he could build a life that was entirely his own. That night, Jake received an email from Forsyth Solutions with a formal offer. He accepted, feeling a surge of relief. He was ready to take on this new challenge, and more importantly, he was ready to put the past behind him. Things with Melissa, however, were only getting worse. She had been out almost every night, her texts to him sparse and clipped. Jake barely saw her around the apartment, and when they did cross paths, she looked at him with a mixture of anger and pity, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. One Friday evening, she cornered him in the kitchen as he was making a sandwich, her face set in an expression he couldn't read. "So, I heard through the grapevine that you're selling the house," she said, her tone icy. Jake met her gaze, his hands still. "Yeah, Melissa, we're getting a divorce. I'm not staying here. You made it clear you want your own life, so I'm moving on." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something. Maybe regret, maybe fear. But she quickly masked it with a smirk. "You really think you're going to just walk away?" she sneered. "This is my life too, Jake. Don't think for a second that you can just take everything and leave me with nothing." Jake took a steadying breath. He'd known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. Melissa was used to being in control, and she wasn't going to let go without a fight. "I'm not leaving you with nothing, Melissa, but I'm not going to keep supporting you while you live your separate life," he said, his voice firm. "I deserve better than that." She laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, please, Jake. You wouldn't last a day on your own. You need me. Without me, you're just a washed-up engineer with no friends and no future." The words stung, but Jake refused to let her see it. He had spent too many years letting her chip away at his confidence, and he wasn't going to give her that power anymore. "We'll see about that," he replied, his voice calm. "I'm filing for divorce, and I'm moving on. If you want to drag this out, that's your choice. But I'm done." Melissa stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. Jake stood there, his heart pounding, but he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had finally said it. He was done. Over the next few weeks, Jake settled into his new job at Forsyth Solutions. The work was challenging but rewarding, and he quickly found himself fitting in with his new colleagues. Mark introduced him to a few of his friends, and before long, Jake found himself with a small but close-knit circle of people who supported him. He'd also found an apartment in Oak Park, a modest one-bedroom with a view of the trees that lined the quiet street below. It was nothing fancy, but it was his. A fresh start, a new chapter. He packed up the last of his things from the Lakeview apartment, leaving behind memories that no longer held any power over him. One Saturday, as he was settling into his new place, he received a call from Linda. "Good news, Jake," she said, her voice warm. "Melissa's agreed to a settlement. It's not perfect, but it's fair, and it'll save you both from a lengthy court battle." Jake felt a wave of relief. The thought of a long, drawn-out fight had weighed heavily on him, and he was grateful that Melissa had finally agreed to let go. They finalized the paperwork over the following weeks, dividing their assets and closing the chapter on their marriage. It wasn't easy, but Jake felt a sense of peace as he signed the final papers. This was the closure he needed, the freedom he had been searching for. On his first night in the new apartment, Jake sat on the small balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand as he looked out at the quiet street below. He thought about everything he had been through, the years he had spent trapped in a life that no longer felt like his own. But now he was free. He had a new job, a new home, and a new life waiting for him. As he took a sip, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder that life went on, that there were new adventures and new opportunities waiting for him. And for the first time in a long time, Jake was ready to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning, and he was finally ready to embrace it. The following weeks in Oak Park felt surreal. Jake hadn't realized how much tension he had been carrying until he felt it lift. The divorce was final, the house was sold, and Melissa was out of his life. For the first time in years, he could make decisions without a second thought about how they would affect someone else. His new job at Forsyth Solutions had quickly become a refuge. He dove into his work, grateful for the fresh start. The team was smaller than what he was used to, but the people here were ambitious and hard-working. He quickly struck up a friendship with Amelia, a project manager who joined the company around the same time as he did. Amelia had a bright, easy laugh and a sharp mind. She was good at her job and, more importantly, treated Jake like an equal, something he hadn't felt in a long time. On the weekends, Jake explored Oak Park. He'd grown up in a small town and had never felt truly at home in Chicago, but Oak Park had a charm that reminded him of his roots. He spent Saturday mornings walking through the farmers market, chatting with local vendors, picking up fresh produce, and enjoying the slower pace of suburban life. It was a routine he found surprisingly comforting. One Sunday afternoon, he got a call from his lawyer, Linda. Her tone was serious, though she tried to keep it light. "Jake, it's probably nothing, but Melissa's lawyer reached out to me today," Linda began, pausing. "She's claiming she deserves a larger share of the settlement. They're saying she feels misled about the value of the house and some of your other assets." Jake let out a long sigh. Melissa just couldn't let go, it seemed. He had thought that signing the divorce papers would be the end of it, but Melissa had a way of making everything more difficult than it needed to be. "Linda, I'm not interested in reopening the case. I gave her a fair share, more than fair, honestly. Can she really push this?" "She can try, but it's not likely she'll succeed, especially given the final agreement." "Still, I wanted to give you a heads up," Linda replied, sounding confident. "Thanks, Linda. I appreciate it. Let me know if anything changes, but I'm not going to lose sleep over this," Jake said, trying to shake off the frustration. He ended the call, feeling a pang of resentment. He had done everything he could to make a clean break, yet she still found a way to claw back into his life. But Jake was different now. He wasn't the man she could manipulate anymore. He had his boundaries, and he was determined to protect them. That week, Jake decided to take Amelia up on an invitation to grab a drink after work. They found a cozy pub near the office, and he found himself genuinely looking forward to the evening. Amelia was easy to talk to, and he enjoyed her company. They chatted about work, shared stories from their past, and eventually started talking about relationships. "So, what's your story, Jake?" she asked, resting her chin on her hand. "You seem like a guy who's been through some stuff." Jake laughed, sipping his drink. "That's one way to put it. Yeah, I just went through a divorce. It was messy, but I'm doing okay." Amelia nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes you have to go through the mess to find yourself again, you know?" Jake appreciated her perspective. She wasn't prying, just listening, and he realized he hadn't felt this comfortable talking about his life in a long time. "What about you?" he asked, curious. Amelia shrugged, smiling. "Nothing is dramatic, but I did have to leave behind a few relationships that weren't working. I've learned that life's too short to stay where you're unhappy." They ended the evening on a light note, parting ways with a promise to meet up again. Jake walked back to his apartment feeling lighter. He wasn't interested in rushing into anything, but he liked the idea of new friendships, new connections, and maybe in time something more. In the months that followed, Jake found himself settling into a rhythm. He focused on work, building a solid reputation at Forsyth Solutions, and establishing himself as someone the team could rely on. Mark, true to his word, gave him opportunities to lead on projects, and Jake threw himself into each one with determination. His confidence grew with every success, and he found himself becoming the man he had always wanted to be. One morning, Jake received a package at the office. It was an envelope with no return address, but he immediately recognized Melissa's handwriting. He hesitated, debating whether to even open it. But curiosity got the better of him, and he tore it open. Inside was a short, typed letter. Asterisk, asterisk, Jake, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, and I know I took more from you than I deserved. Maybe I thought I could make things right by pushing you away, but it's clear now that I was wrong, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you that in my own way, I did care about you. I'm moving out of Chicago, so this is probably the last you'll hear from me. I hope you find happiness, asterisk, asterisk. Melissa. Jake stared at the letter, a mixture of emotions swirling within him. He felt an odd sense of closure, though he didn't feel the forgiveness Melissa might have hoped for. But as he folded the letter and put it in his desk, he realized he was finally free. The anger, the resentment, even the regret, they had all faded. He was no longer bound by the life he had shared with her. He was his own person, ready to embrace the future. Later that week, Jake invited Amelia and a few other colleagues to a housewarming party. He had just moved into a small bungalow near the edge of Oak Park, a place he had found after months of saving and planning. It was modest, but it was all his, a symbol of his independence and hard-won freedom. The evening was filled with laughter, music, and friendly conversation. Jake realized he was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him, people who were part of his new life. He couldn't have imagined this a year ago, but now he couldn't imagine anything else. As the night wound down, Amelia stayed to help clean up, and they sat on his porch, watching the stars against the quiet suburban sky. "Do you think you'll stay here?" she asked, looking out at the street. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I think I will. It feels like home." Amelia smiled, and they fell into a comfortable silence. Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a feeling of belonging he hadn't thought he'd find again. "Thanks for everything, Amelia," he said, turning to her. "You've been a good friend." She gave him a warm smile, her eyes kind. "Anytime, Jake. Here's to new beginnings." Jake raised an imaginary glass, and they laughed, letting the quiet of the night settle around them. In that moment, Jake knew he had finally come full circle. His journey had been painful, full of heartbreak and difficult choices, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever life had in store. His past was behind him, and for the first time, he was looking forward, filled with hope and a sense of possibility. This was his life now, his chance to start over, to build something new and meaningful, and he was ready to embrace it.